Where are you today? We're saying our final goodbye to John, our son who passed away, and my husband didn't even show up to the funeral. I'm going to call him. When I did, his voice sounded cheerful. I'm in Bermuda for my parents' 73rd anniversary, he said. My mom overheard and was shocked at first, but then she got really angry. They're in Bermuda? She yelled. Mom lost her temper and decided to confront my husband and his parents. My name is Mary. I'm 43 years old and work in an office. I married my husband Larry 13 years ago, and we have one son together. Our son John is in the hospital. He was diagnosed with leukemia 4 years ago and has been there ever since. Even though he started elementary school, he couldn't go much, but his classmates would visit sometimes, and that made him really happy. Seeing John smile and fight so hard gives me strength. My parents visit John every day too. I can't wait for John to get better so we can go out and eat some delicious food together. My mom says John has been really brave through his tough treatments. My mom is still healthy, but my dad was diagnosed with dementia a few years ago, and sometimes he says things that don't make sense. When he came to see John the other day, he mistook me for a nurse and thanked me for taking care of his grandson. It made me sad, but I was also surprised that he hadn't forgotten about John. Even though he mixes things up, he still knows John is sick. My mom sighed and said it's clear Dad is really worried about John. John understands about dementia too, so when his grandpa says something odd, he just plays along nicely. While John's school friends and my parents are worried about him, it feels like my husband doesn't care. I asked him, "Can't you come visit John? Aren't you worried about him going through all these treatments?" But my husband said, "John doesn't like me, so it's probably better if I don't. I stay away because I'm really busy." It's true that John and his dad didn't get along, but as his father, Larry should still try to be there for him. Larry never helped with taking care of John after he was born, so it's no surprise John didn't like him. Larry seemed to care more about his own parents than his son. Whenever he had free time, he would go to their place, saying he was busy helping them. My in-laws don't seem to care about John either. They hardly ever visit him in the hospital. It's really cold-hearted, not just on Larry's part, but his parents too. My mom was clearly unhappy with how Larry and his parents were acting. She complained with a disapproving look, especially annoyed that my husband doesn't come to see his son. I half-jokingly said, "Maybe I married the wrong person. Larry was so kind when we were dating, but now he's cold to both me and John, even though our son is seriously ill." My husband only seems to care about his own parents, and it's really starting to bother me. Mom seemed to think I regretted marrying Larry. She looked at me sadly and said, "If I had known Larry was like this, I would never have introduced him to you. I feel like I was misled by the uncle who introduced you to." My husband and I met through my dad's brother. It seems my uncle and father-in-law knew each other, and when they talked about finding a wife for Larry, my name came up. I wasn't seeing anyone at the time, so I decided to meet Larry casually. He seemed kind, and I liked him, but I wasn't ready for marriage yet. However, Larry really liked me and asked if we could start dating seriously. Before I knew it, we were getting married. My mom also noticed that Larry's parents changed completely after we got married. Before, they seemed humble, but after the wedding, they became different people. My mother-in-law, who was always smiling before, suddenly turned strict and spoke harshly to me. She said, "Mary, you're part of this family now, so you need to do as I say. If you don't listen, we'll make sure you get a proper divorce quickly." I thought my father-in-law was a quiet man, but he started making insulting remarks like, "We only let you marry Larry because the head of our family introduced you. Otherwise, there's no way we would have let someone like you marry our son." He would say that whenever there was an issue. My uncle runs a real estate company, and my father-in-law has a contract with it. When my uncle introduced me, he apparently mentioned that I was from a wealthy family. Because of this, my father-in-law thought my dad owned a lot of properties, which is why he made those remarks. I hadn't heard anything about this from my dad or uncle, so I believed what my father-in-law said. After we got married, we moved into the house where my maternal grandparents used to live. My grandparents had passed away, and the house was empty, so we renovated it a bit and moved in. My family had considered renting out the house because leaving it empty could lead to it falling apart. But when my husband found out about the empty house, he pleaded with my parents, saying, "I promise we'll take good care of it, so please let us live there. The house is close to her family too, so we can also help look after her parents." That made sense since it was near his family too, and we could both help out our parents. However, having his parents close by, especially after they changed so much after the wedding, became a burden for me. On top of that, Larry would often invite his parents over to our house and start bragging, saying things like, "Our house is new and must make you so jealous. It's a lot bigger, maybe even twice the size of yours." When Larry talked like he owned the place, his father seemed annoyed, but his mother smiled and said, "We could live together here. It might be an old house, but it's better than where we live now." After they left, I asked my husband, "Are you planning to have your parents move in with us? This isn't even your house." My husband just laughed and said it was a joke, but even if he was joking, my mother-in-law seemed serious about moving in, which made me uneasy. After that, my in-laws kept coming over, looking around the house and saying whatever they wanted. Living here would be better than our poor house. At least there's no rent in this dump, my father-in-law said. I was annoyed when he called it a dump, and my mother-in-law ignored me while picking out a room for herself. Since my husband wasn't speaking up, I decided to tell them the truth. We're borrowing this house from my parents. My grandparents used to live here, so of course it's a bit old. My in-laws were surprised to hear that, but then my father-in-law quickly responded with an angry look. "That's why it's in such poor condition." He called it poor, but I thought it was better than their house. My mother-in-law didn't seem to believe me and started saying whatever she wanted, asking, "Why are you lying? I trust my son more than you." Even though my mother-in-law didn't believe me, it didn't change the fact that we were borrowing the house, so I didn't argue further. I was worried about what would happen if my in-laws tried to move in with us, but when I found out I was pregnant, the whole discussion about the moving in stopped. Maybe they realized they'd have to help with the baby if they lived with us, so they suddenly became quiet. My mother-in-law said, "Mary's parents should take care of the baby since they live nearby, so I won't have to do it." I never asked her for help with the baby, but she said that anyway. Since we lived close to both my parents and my in-laws, I couldn't stop thinking that she really didn't want to help with the baby. I wondered how they could not be excited about their first grandchild. When I told my mom what my mother-in-law said, she just laughed and said, "Leave the babysitting to me. You don't need to ask someone who doesn't want to care for their sweet grandchild." I thought my mom was right and planned to ask for her help once the baby was born. After a while, when my son was born, my parents were thrilled, but my in-laws only visited once. My husband also didn't seem moved by the birth of our son, which was disappointing. My mom tried to cheer me up by saying, "Don't worry, once the baby arrives, Larry will develop affection for him. He might not feel like a father yet." But my husband continued to show no interest in our son. Then, when our son turned 6, he became ill. After tests at the hospital, he was diagnosed with pediatric cancer. My husband, who was supposed to support me through the shock, said, "You'll have to cover the medical expenses yourself. It's not my problem." I was angry at his attitude as a father. My mother-in-law also made harsh remarks saying, "It's because Mary passed on her genes that John has cancer. None of our relatives have anything like that, so it must be your fault." Hearing my husband and mother-in-law's comments, my father stood up for me, saying, "Don't you care about John? We'll take care of him, so you can do whatever you want." My father, who was very supportive at that time, made my husband and in-laws leave quietly. Even though I was already distressed by my son's illness, their harsh words made me feel even worse. My mom encouraged me, saying, "Don't be discouraged. John will be upset if you don't stay strong. We'll do everything we can to support you. Let's work together." Encouraged by my mother, I decided to stay strong for my son. I realized I couldn't rely on my husband anymore, so I focused on taking care of our son and working. My parents, who were already retired, helped with looking after him, and I was very grateful. Even though our son was diagnosed with pediatric cancer, his condition improved, and he was able to live almost like a normal child. However, my husband started questioning if our son really had cancer and accused me of trying to deceive him. He would say things like, Is John really sick, or are you just trying to fool me? Seeing our son playing happily, my husband continued making inappropriate comments. I ignored him because talking to him seemed pointless. After the diagnosis, my husband wasn't around much. He spent a lot of time at his parents' place, which actually made things easier for me since all he did was complain. My parents came over to help with our son, which made my husband seem even less interested. But after our son was hospitalized 3 years ago, my husband started spending more time at home. He would say things like, "Leave the housework to me. You can go to the hospital. By the way, how about giving me this house?" When I came back from the hospital, he would smirk and make these comments. I ignored him, but I could tell he was more concerned about the house again. I was annoyed, thinking about how he was planning to move in with his parents without caring about our son. Around this time, my father was diagnosed with dementia, and both my mom and I were busy, so we couldn't focus on our house. We hadn't explained my father's condition to my husband or in-laws, so even when my father came over, my husband didn't seem to notice what was happening. "Your parents came over today, but they were just walking around. Aren't they going to help with John?" my husband would say, acting relaxed. Since I couldn't take my father for a walk alone, my mom always accompanied him. Explaining everything to my husband seemed too exhausting, so I said nothing. My uncle also visited occasionally and often had serious discussions with my mother. I was curious about what they talked about since my uncle always looked serious. When I asked my mom, she only gave vague answers. While I was worried about my mom and uncle, my son's condition worsened. I had been prepared for it, but seeing how critical it was overwhelmed me. With my husband being unreliable and my father suffering from dementia, I had no choice but to rely on my mother. When I updated my husband on our son's condition, he said something shocking. "I'm busy right now, so stop calling. You handle John's situation." I was furious at his lack of responsibility as a parent and seriously considered separating from him. After a while, my son passed away, and I was in such shock that I couldn't do anything. My mother and uncle took care of everything, allowing me to stay by my son's side. Just before the funeral, my uncle started to panic, asking, "Where are Larry and his parents? They can't skip the funeral, can they?" Seeing him so stressed, I called my husband and asked, "Where are you? It's time to say goodbye to John." My husband replied, "I'm at a party celebrating my parents' anniversary. I told you not to call right now." Hearing his voice through the phone, my mother and uncle were furious. My mother turned red with anger and said, "He's in Bermuda." I hadn't expected anything from my husband, but finding out he went on a vacation to Bermuda while John was in critical condition made me lose my temper. "You knew John was in a critical state and still went on a trip? I feel sorry for John for having a father like you," I said before hanging up the phone. Holding back tears, my mother comforted me, saying, "I will never forgive them. Don't worry, everything will be gone by the time they return from Bermuda." I was so confused by my anger and sadness that I didn't fully understand what my mother meant, but I knew I had to stay strong for my son. Thanks to my uncle and mother, the funeral went smoothly. After the funeral, I was left feeling lost. I had centered my life around my son, and now I didn't know what to do next. My uncle advised me, "Leave the future to me, Mary. You should go back to your parents' house and take it easy." Following his advice, I returned to my parents' house and helped take care of my father while settling in. My workplace was considerate and allowed me a long break, which was a relief. When I had almost forgotten about my husband, I received a call from him. "Mary, I can't get into the house. Did you change the locks?" "Changing them without notice is awful," he said, sounding panicked. I replied, "I haven't changed the locks. I'm planning to end things with you, so don't call me anymore." And then I immediately hung up. After a while, my husband called again, sounding even more frantic. "My parents' house has been demolished. What's going on? There's even a land for sale. Sign up. I don't understand what you're talking about, he said. I told him, I'm going to hang up and check with my uncle, and ended the call. When I checked with my uncle, he seemed pleased and asked me to come over to my in-laws' family home. I went as he instructed to see what was happening. When I arrived, I found my husband and in-laws standing there, looking shocked. My husband demanded, "What's going on?" "My parents' house is gone. Did you do this because we didn't take you to Bermuda? Did you tear down the house because of that?" Frustrated by my mother-in-law's confusing accusation, I replied, "I could never do that. I had a funeral to attend." Just as the situation was getting tense, my uncle and mother arrived. My mother yelled, "People who didn't even attend the funeral have no right to complain. You should at least reflect on your actions." Larry and his parents went silent for a moment, but then my father-in-law began to complain. "You can't just demolish the house and sell the land. I'm the owner of this property." Seeing my father-in-law's strange claims, I started to wonder if he might be suffering from dementia. He proudly presented a contract, saying, "We got the house and land from your father. Here's a contract to prove it." The contract he showed had my father's signature, but it looked suspiciously unofficial. Moreover, it stated that the property was given away for free, which seemed impossible. This contract can't be valid. Besides, my father is suffering from dementia and can't make sound judgments, I said. Larry's parents insisted the contract was valid, claiming they didn't know about my father's condition. My mother then spoke up. "This land is registered under my name, so he cannot sign the contract. You knew my father was suffering from dementia and forced him to sign, didn't you?" I was shocked by my mother's words, but Larry and his parents were even more unsettled. As my father-in-law refused to believe her, my uncle showed everyone the land's details and lease agreement. The land and the building both belonged to Mary's mother. "We had to terminate the lease because you were behind on rent payments, and we put the property up for sale. We repeatedly tried to arrange meetings with you, but you ignored us. We had no choice but to take legal action," my uncle explained. Larry's parents stared at the documents in silence. My father-in-law asked, "Were you behind on rent? Why didn't you pay?" My mother-in-law, looking confused, admitted, "I thought it was fine since we became relatives with her uncle." Then she revealed the truth. "Actually, we were planning to deceive your father into giving us the land, so we didn't think we needed to pay the rent." I was shocked to hear about the unpaid rent, but I became even angrier when I realized they had planned to deceive my father from the start. My anger grew, and I was about to protest when Larry suddenly pulled out a contract and, looking regretful, asked my mother, "Is the house we live in also yours? Does that mean this contract is meaningless too?" The contract Larry was holding had my father's signature, just like the previous one. It seemed Larry had misunderstood, thinking our home also belonged to my father, and had created a fake contract. It's ridiculous that they tried to deceive us without even checking who owned the land. "I'm glad we found out in time," my mother said, astonished, while Larry and his parents shook with anger. My mother then explained that her father was a significant landowner in the area, including around their home, which shocked both Larry and me. Suddenly, a young woman appeared and demanded, "Please pay for the travel expenses I covered. When will the life insurance for your late son be paid out?" Seeing the woman, Larry panicked. My uncle grinned and said, "Even after your son's death, you brought your mistress to Bermuda? You've really outdone yourself. We've investigated everything." I was surprised again, but quickly realized the woman was Larry's mistress. It seemed my uncle had suspected Larry of cheating and had secretly investigated. As my mother and uncle discussed the situation seriously, the woman, who had appeared at the worst possible time, quickly fled. I can't believe Larry was such a terrible person. Our son must be horrified from heaven, I said, but Larry seemed unaffected and chased after his mistress. I turned to his parents and said, "How does it feel to have enjoyed yourselves in Bermuda, hoping to rely on your grandchild's insurance money? Unfortunately for you, I'm the beneficiary of the insurance, so you'll have to pay for the travel expenses yourselves." Unable to respond, Larry's parents hurriedly left. After the funeral, I realized that my mother had intended to completely remove Larry and his parents from our lives. Following this, I divorced Larry and filed for alimony. It turned out my ex-husband had been cheating for 3 years and planned to leave me after our son passed away. He thought that once our son was gone, he wouldn't have to pay child support or deal with any responsibilities and would benefit from the life insurance. He even confessed his infidelity to his parents and took them on a trip to Bermuda. He knew about my father's dementia and took advantage of it by secretly getting him to sign a contract while our son was critically ill. Since my mother and I were busy taking care of our son, we had left my father with a home helper, which gave my ex-husband the chance to act. He managed to get my father to sign the contract as planned, but he didn't realize that the land actually belonged to my mother. My mother had inherited both pieces of land from my father and had entrusted their management to my uncle, who runs a real estate company. My father-in-law, who was renting the land and property from my uncle, mistakenly thought it was still my father's land. This mistake was a major oversight. Without checking the details, my ex-husband and his parents focused only on trying to make money. In the end, they accumulated a large amount of debt. Now, my ex-husband not only has to pay alimony but also cover the costs of the family's trip to Bermuda, leaving him financially strained. My in-laws were also asked to pay the overdue rent and turn to their son for help, but he could barely handle his own debts. They hadn't paid the rent earlier because they were already struggling with debt. They had hoped to clear their debt by acquiring the land, but it turned out to be my mother's property. Now, burdened with debt, my ex-husband has even lost his mistress and is living alone in misery. As I return to my family home, I'm finally starting to recover from the shock of losing my son. Since my mother is also dealing with my father's dementia, I can't afford to stay sad forever. I believe my son in heaven would be worried if he saw me so down, so I want to stay positive, within my limits. Sometimes my father says strange things like today when he mentioned that John is visiting and running around happily. I was surprised by his words, but maybe my father can still see my son. I choose to believe that my son is watching over us, and we should live cheerfully for his sake.